risk speaking a few prophetic words today ahead of our meeting after church. And for that reason, I'm not going to dwell too much on the gospel for today, because though there is no cliff nearby, I choose not to be hurled off anything if I can help it. But instead I want to talk about the reading from Jeremiah and the entire passage from 1 Corinthians 13. Let's start with the obvious. 1 Corinthians 13. Where do we hear 1 Corinthians 13 most often?
Weddings.
It's a crying shame, too. Not that it doesn't belong at weddings, but that it is not bounded by weddings. That the love described in Corinthians is bigger than that. And I got big love in my marriage, but the love described in Corinthians is more than that. And it is a love that can inspire us, that can make us take crazy risks, can allow us to depend upon one another in ways that don't make sense to many folks. So I want you to hold that for a minute, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But now I want to direct your attention to Jeremiah. The prophet Jeremiah is someone that I hope we can identify with. Jeremiah comes from a prophetic school that is not from a scholarly class. Amos was not a scholar. Some of the other prophets were just ordinary folks. And Jeremiah was perhaps one of the most ordinary of folks in his day and age, in the culture in which he was raised. He was just a kid. And he says as much in this scripture. The word of the Lord came to me, this is Jeremiah speaking, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. The word for nations in there is a form of the word Gentile. When you read it in Greek, the Greek version of the Old Testament that Paul would have read was called the Septuagint. It's called the Septuagint because in order for people who did not speak Hebrew, Jewish people who did not speak Hebrew, and there were lots of them, to be able to read the ancient texts throughout the Greco-Roman world, they needed to be translated into a language that's accessible. Does it sound familiar? Something like the Reformation that happened for us in the 16th century, that by the translation of Scripture into the vernacular, it became accessible to all people, or at least to those who were literate, and by extension to those who could hear that language and understand it when it was read. So the Septuagint is a big thing. It's called the Septuagint. What does sept mean?
7.
So actually, this is 70, they sent 70 scholars out together so that they would independently translate this, and then they would come back and they would reconcile these translations. And they figured that the Spirit of God would speak separately in a way that would form consensus among people, and they were able to make their decisions. I can only imagine what that room must have been like. I know what seminary was like when you had 15 people with a variety of opinions in the same group. I know what the Episcopal Church is like when you get people of varieties of opinions in the same group. Right? Wherever 2 or 3 Episcopalians are gathered together, there will be 6 or 8 different opinions. And that's okay. Because our God is not bounded by absolutes. Our God will not be put in a box. God defies that with all that God has. And so God reaches down and touches the tongue of this boy. To go out and speak to the nations. To the people who are spread far and wide. Then I said, I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. Now this is something that is, you can kind of tell a prophet who's really a prophet when they try not to be a prophet. Right? The people that I am most concerned about when it comes to speaking prophetic voices and to speak prophetically are people who are absolutely sure what they're saying is true. That they somehow have a direct line to God. And that you need to depend on what they say because of who they are, not because of who God is. God reaches down and touches those with whom he'll speak and who he will speak through. And God's having none of it. Don't tell me you're only a boy. Because, as he said before, I have anointed you. I have made you my own from before I knew you. And that is not a unique circumstance to Jeremiah. In baptism, we say that before you were born, God knew you. You existed in the heart of God from the beginning of all things. Take a moment to ponder that. In many ways, the spiritual path is about returning to the heart of God. We were born in the heart of God. We existed there from the time that God was. That God was in relationship, and the Spirit that moved over the waters, the winds, the incarnation of God in the people, in Jesus, in the God that was the creative force of all things, contained you. And that's consistent with scientific theory. You know that, right? That we believe, or that cosmologists believe, that the Big Bang began from nothing, and all things were contained in it and forever expanded. And that there is a limited amount of matter, and that we're part of it. Think about that for just a minute. That all matter was created in that moment, so that all the stuff that makes up you, that thing that is what regenerated, your cells regenerate, what do they say, every 7 years, something like that? All of that stuff that goes into making up you existed from the beginning of time. We are just bags of stardust on a rock hurtling through space. Take a minute to wrap your head around that, and that God cares about that. And that God wants to enter into that life. And that God calls us into community so that we can see the reflected image and likeness of God, and to hear God's word not in a universal tone of unity to sing in unison, but that God looks for harmony. Right? Psalm 133 was the psalm I was assigned, or maybe I chose it as my psalm for psalm class in seminary. How pleasant and good it is when people live together in unison. One of the translations says when people live together in harmony. It's not that we all sing the same tune, but that we all sing tunes that fit together. That our common life and the expression of our love for God and for one another is based in an individual interpretation, an individual understanding and incarnation of the call of God on our lives. And that's where I think we get it right with the baptismal covenant. And that's why I think it's a critically important part for us to use in framing our discernment about what we are called to be and what we are called to do and how we are called to live in a world that is, in terms of love, impoverished. The Lord goes on to speak to Jeremiah. He said, I've touched you, and touches his mouth. I put my words in your mouth. Go and talk about these things. Go and talk about, it says, see, I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Sometimes in order to build something, we have to tear something down first. Deconstruction sometimes precedes the beginning of a new thing. Seems to me consistent with people, or those of us who follow Jesus and believe that resurrection is the end, the ultimate for us all, that we will all be raised up again into the nearer presence of God, that Jesus' death was not the end, but his resurrection put the end to death. That we no longer look as death as the enemy, but as an already defeated foe. And that we can live with confidence and do things like love one another and not play zero-sum games. We've been going through Romans chapter by chapter, and Paul lays this out brilliantly in Romans. The theologian Karl Barth said that every great reformation of the church has always begun with a thorough and deep rereading of Romans. He lays out a theology that says, we've gotten it wrong for too long, whether it be in Judaism or in Christianity, or I would even argue in whatever fundamental religion that we talk about. He's looking at a basic sense of what belonging, or what a community, how a community of faith is built. And when I was growing up, a community of faith was generally built with, and pardon me for those of you who were in class this morning, we went through this before, but it was understood that the way we were incorporated into the community was that we came to church, and then we behaved, and then we believed, and then we belonged. I had to go, I had to keep my mouth shut, I had to pretend to pay attention, and then somehow by osmosis I would come to believe whatever was being said from the pulpit, and then suddenly I would be able to go to catechism class, or memorize the entire catechism so I could answer questions from the bishop, and then I would belong, and I would be able to eat the holy cookie and drink the wine. That's how I understood the church as a cradle Episcopalian. That was the procession into belonging. And it was not dissimilar to the early church that set up the liturgy for the liturgy of the word, and then all those who were not baptized had to leave until they were baptized. They could not receive or even experience the liturgy of the table until baptism. And we turned that back on itself and reclaimed that to a certain extent in our quote-unquote new prayer book, which is now 40 years old. We have an obligation to bring people into community. And in this day and age, I would argue that we need to continue to understand that belonging is the goal, but it doesn't need to be the end game. It is part of the DNA of this congregation to accept people as they are into this community and to celebrate their uniqueness. And I would say that we are closer than most congregations to getting what I believe to be the proper way, what Romans tells us, what Jesus tells us about how people come into community, and that it is precisely the opposite of the way that we've been taught. In Romans, Paul spends about 8 chapters talking about the law and grace, and that the law is sent to us to show that we can't obey the law. Now, there's some doublespeak if I've ever heard it, right? But when you unpack it, it's true. That if I try and do everything right so God will accept me, I'm always going to be an outsider, because I'm never going to do everything right. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But if I understand a God in whose heart I was from the beginning of time, it's easier for me to believe and trust a God that is benevolent, that wants the best for me. I told a group this morning at Bible study that I used to take a perverse pleasure in, I don't know if you did this when you were in grade school, that you would swap papers with people to grade spelling. I used to love checking people wrong because I knew I was one step closer to being better than they were. And that's what Paul's talking about in the law. He's trying to undercut the notion that we have to compare ourselves to one another, that the way to holiness is to prove that there is someone who is less holy than us. What a small world, what a small God. But what Paul is saying is that you are accepted just as you are, and the change, the difference in coming to the community is first you belong. And you belong simply because you are God's, and that you are beloved, and the apple of God's eye. And that when you're loved into that, you start to believe that you can act in a way that is consistent with the wishes that God has for you. And lo and behold, before you even try to keep the law, you notice that without even trying, you've changed. You don't do the things that you used to do. You don't turn other people into objects. You start to live into the basics of almost every world religion that is what? Love one another. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's the kind of love that covers a multitude of sins. That's the kind of love that is at the core of what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians. And I know that I had 1 Corinthians read at least one of my weddings. I don't remember so much about the first one. I don't know whether that's intentional or otherwise. But the kind of love that Paul is talking about here is bigger than a binary love between a man and a woman, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, any kind of union that you can talk about that is binary, that is bounded. That kind of love is supposed to expand and include everyone around it. That kind of love is supposed to witness to the greater love that God had for creation from the beginning of time. Because as John says in the 3rd chapter of his gospel, why did God create the world? Why did God send Jesus to the world? For God so loved the world. God didn't want to check the spelling papers of all of us wrong. God was not the 4th grade hall monitor that was drunk with power. God was not the guy who kept his crossing guard sash until he was in high school, because it was the glory days of when he was somebody. God is tender. God is inviting us in. And the things that are the antithesis of God, the banging cymbal, those are the things that we need to be aware of being more style than substance. We are people of substance. This community is made of substantial people. I got a gift in the mail today from Father Peter Stimson, and a lovely letter from him with a copy of a book he wrote for the parish library. And he sends his love along to you. But one line in the letter stood out to me. It says, "By this time, Father Hicks, you will know what I know about St. Mark's, is that they are wonderful people. And more than being individually wonderful people, you are a wonderful people. A people who are the apple of God's eye. And that God has something to say through you all." Or as I was taught to translate Greek in Texas Seminary, God is able to do something with all y'all. Our witness and ministry is not bounded by anything other than our willingness to believe that we are in God's heart from before time and forever. That's the love that St. Paul talks about in the 13th chapter of Romans. A love that is reckless, a love that is boundless, a love that just is without condition. So I invite us all as we enter into the the hinge of our discernment, to remember that God's love is so big, that God's choices for us are more than we can ask or imagine, and that God has anointed us to speak a prophetic word. Because there are congregations around this city, around this diocese, who struggle with the same issues that we are struggling with, but refuse to face them. We have faced into what we are up against, and in the words of at least someone on the vestry, I won't out them, but they say this is for them an exciting time to see what God will do and to recognize that God is not finished. My dad's mother was a bit of a conundrum. She was a challenging personality, to hear my mom say it, but that might just be a mother-in-law, daughter-in-law thing. She was very elegant. I don't ever remember her in church except maybe once to have my uncle baptized and maybe at a funeral. But at least 3 different places in her house, she had needlepoint that she had done that said, "Please be patient with me. God is not finished with me yet." So I invite us all as we continue into this path of discernment and movement in the Spirit of God, to be patient with one another. God is not done with us yet. And to remember that the love of God is the glue that binds this community together. And the door will open through this hinge time to a preferred and promised future that God has already imagined and that God has already prepared for us to walk into, full of faith.